Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval chivalry, and today we'll couple completely randomly a question and answer video from a user that we will see, whose question we'll see in a while, and actually the completely random choice in my schedule of the same exact topic that can actually answer that specific question. And more in general, this topic addresses the broader question: medieval chivalry and knighthood, etc. Terms are important that we're making now since a year or two, and that we still haven't properly started in depth. Albeit we made several videos already, tens of videos now about it. And the question is properly, I will read it to you. Actually, it arrived in two chunks. I will paraphrase it, so maybe it's better. So, or maybe it's not necessary. I'm trying to get to know when historians estimate the concept of chivalry to start, in brackets, ethics, code, etc. Not the knights as heavy cavalry, but chivalry as a cultural, noble way of life, and doing combat by trying to follow rules, or act like trying. User further contacted me and asked me, just wanted to ask a quick question, please reply with at least an approximate date that is, 1170s. At which decade would you pinpoint the beginning of chivalry in Western Europe, like courtly life and manners, code of conduct, higher morals, in brackets, sense of nobility? Crouch places it around 1200. On Wiki it says 1170, but there is no literature apparently for that. Quote, some other websites suggest even earlier, I guess because of tournaments. I'm not asking about military orders like Templars, but knights in general. When did they start to care about all this entourage of chivalry? So now, I understand, first of all, the user is very interested in this, and I wouldn't like to disappoint him in, as a matter of fact, especially properly in the pinpointing phase of, what's the decade in which chivalry was born. So probably I'm not the best person to be asked this, because as for those who have followed me in this series, that I'm basically developing all a religious military interpretation of history that properly I've never quite met, aside from certain history of religion or anthropology studies and so on, that however do not expand on military history proper, as instead I do mostly for a living properly. So my answer in this, also just by method in general, is that to me there is not properly a decade when you can't pinpoint that. So I'm not going to properly answer that. And I could make an enormous premise that would make me digress, and I will avoid it, but probably will catch up later about this. The question here hints at the second half of the 12th century. So this time, and I will give you that in the beginning of the 13th, right? So this time is being identified rightfully, from a historiographical point of view, as properly the moment of definition, right, of the idea of chivalry, which is something very different. It's a very still modernistically influenced idea of what chivalry should be. It's a bit like, here also tracing parallelisms is a bit difficult, a bit like heraldry, right? It's the fixation of certain categorical standards for which we can start identifying through the sources certain things that altogether we can come to define like that. This is also a strictly historical problem, meaning that before these centuries we're not dramatically documented on chivalry proper, right? This is evident, for example, for dubbing, knight's dubbing. That is something that we have to wait for the end of the 12th century to emerge from the penumbra of the sources. But to answer the question, more generally, say that what the chivalry defined here is that what entire generations of authors, especially in fact between the 12th and the 13th century, would endeavor to propagate, right? And it is the Cortos ideal of measure, right? Which is, by the way, of Aristotelian Ciceronian origin, right? It's a kind of classical re-edition that is formulated in this specific time in medieval Western Europe. That doesn't necessarily reflect. This is a great problem that we have probably with chivalry, especially from an ethical point of view. The reality of war that the author of the question actually remarks, says, were these guys kind of acting like that or not? So that's a good point. And the point of these authors was fundamentally to underline the significance of the cardinal virtues of prudence and temperance in order to overcome these, certain, faults properly of the knightly class as it had been forming at this point, as we will see. And it's important to stress here that these efforts would be futile, right? It didn't change anything practically. Compared to what existed before. That is, and I can say it, with a certain degree of certainty, given that I've cared about this problem and will keep talking about this, is that it's not really a matter of the fact that these people were not regulated, right, or didn't have morals, or they had, right, but it's exactly because of that they behaved actually in a very different way from what this ideal of chivalry would make us believe. And yes, it's between the 12th and 13th century. It's important to say it's 1170, 80, 90, 1210s, 1200s, 1210s, 1220. Honestly, and I tell this as a historian, to me, basically it has no historical meaning whatsoever. Right, doesn't properly mean anything, but I mean literally anything. I mean, this properly has nothing to do, see, even if we can't get certain, because at the end of the day, where was this ideology paraded? It was fundamentally from literature, from narrative, from the Carolingian cycle, from all these traditions that eventually blossomed also later on. Bannon, you think about the ministeriales in the 12th century, would given life to the great German courtly culture, also the spending from France. We have, in fact, to understand here which countries are we talking about, right, and which political and social realities, and that's why we started this series, and it's not easy at all to ask. And the question here is that this pre-existing ideals that lived within these people, aside from what the literary ones were, sometimes even they were written by themselves, right? Because some of these people were actually composing themselves, reflected also in their political purpose, social purpose too. That was, essentially different also from the military one, right? It had, it was intertwined, but it had properly its own language compared to another reality like the one of war. That it's not a matter of hypocrisy. Right? We don't have to think that every biased source is hypocritical. We are the hypocrites as modern people that fundamentally refuse to understand the context and therefore say, these people were just, nuts or brutes or hypocritical or whatever. Right? We are the ones that actually reason ever more primitively like that because of lack of education. And actually, lack of education properly of the world, not of literacy or whatever. That, as I always say, never think that you're more intelligent or more capable than a person who lived 1,000 years ago, because you're not, right? And especially a knight that had a degree of properly of awareness about the world that proportionally today we can't even dream of, because it simply has escaped our mind, right? That's the thing that we constantly overlook. And we could circumstantiate better all this thing, because the question I would say it's very interesting, right? I would say please, whatever the reason, I don't know whether you needed this date to for some kind of, I don't know. I asked sometimes very specific questions also when back in the day for, kind of conflictual purposes, let's call it in this way. But I can tell you, like, if that's what you're thinking, don't think it, right? Maybe, yeah, go say out there 1170s, whatever, but don't think that this has any historical meaning whatsoever, that it has any historical relevance or practical importance or any kind of other positive applicability, because it has literally and virtually nothing to do with what the world at the time was concretely about, right? And the question could be profitably extended, just by posing some problems of interpretation, then making finally some general reflection. For example, the 11th and the 12th centuries, and especially in feudal society, present us with certain values, feudal and chivalrous, or at the same time, that by no means automatically do not identify a de facto aristocracy. Right? Chivalry proceeded during the 12th century to its affirmation as a juridical aristocracy, that is, a nobility, right? And first and foremost, by the way, yes, because the question also asked, like, did chivalry exist before? Chivalry existed ever since cavalry, literally in the history of mankind, existed, right? There is no such thing like, chivalry begins like in the 1170s, or in the 1080s, or in the 1240s. It doesn't mean anything. Right? Before I answered by giving essentially you that time that is identified in this propagandistic ideal standards, but chivalry did exist before, as hell as it existed, right? And properly also, still, from a literary point of view, it was already there as an ethical code, whatever. It was shared, right? It's just less documented, but it's documented, first of all. It existed, so chivalry is not created. There is not a point in time where you can say, at this point chivalry was born factually, concretely. No, it doesn't mean anything. Like, literally, by any historical standard, it's virtually insignificant. Properly, it's senseless. It's not insignificant. It doesn't mean anything. Also, think about, the ritual characters of the dubbing ceremony that are clarified over the centuries, that range actually from the 10th to the 12th. Some people say, chivalry was born mostly around, Charlemagne's time. Also those that like to fix the thing, because it's Carolingian times that emerged the figure of the... No, right? This thing existed already before, and even properly what we call, as we will see now, as militia, and what I would properly say chivalry to me is born like is the 10th century. And that's what I've mostly fundamentally habituated myself to think like, right? In the 10th century witnesses, in my opinion, the birth of chivalry, in the sense that a military class was created with certain specific codifications. In Western society, in the vassalatic beneficial reality of Latin Germanic background, that's fundamentally the thing we're talking about. And even in this, it's an approximation. And it is true that, to me, this 10th century reflects my own bias of military historian, because there is properly it's not even about the technicality of warfare that gets refined in that century, but it's specifically properly the class. The idea that in society there was a sort of, not of crystallization, because up to the 12th, early 13th century, the militia was open, was inclusive, right? Then there is a lock, and it's interesting that goes in parallel, in fact, with the aforementioned ideal propagandistic definition of chivalry, because it was a moment in which properly this class had to say what was to remain out of it and what was to be ever better defined, all together in a process where these people were taking, in the second half of the 12th century, it's evident, an ever more political and institutional leading role in the kingdoms that had been forming, etc. So the rest of the knights were something different. There is naturally a deep difference between chivalry and knighthood, right? The latter also stressing properly actually a servile condition. There was proper in the early time, in the 10th century, also knights like all together, right? And of chivalry also in a way, because there was always that bond, that connection, and that also wasn't born at the time, right? It's proper of basically every society, right? Since tribal time, I mean, there is properly, and we'll see it better later to answer the question. For example, also with the 11th, 12th centuries, slightly, in between these types, there is the custom spreading of assuming by those who had received the dubbing special insignia, in order to distinguish them from those who had not received that distinction. That is, the right to wear spurs, for example, sword hilt, and a horse bit gilded, to wear cloaks lined with the value and so on. And on the other hand, this implied that were also, as you understand, warriors who fought on horseback who were not recognized as members of the military elite, of the milites. And in fact, that's an important distinction that is paralleled, but there is a deep also philological, background to this. It's not so linear or simple, but in Latin sources in general, there is a distinction between miles and eques, for example, milites and equites and equitatores, right? Which is obviously in this sense the difference between a status, right, and so a cavalryman. You say the knight is the miles is what would define the knight. Also in here with an approximation, because in the same Germanic etymology of knight and connection, there is properly the idea of servitude, right? Which is what you don't usually think about the knight you see as a noble freeman, right? So to tell you also how we mediated culturally these terms in a proper sense, but properly could say modern language, the miles is the knight, whereas the eques is just the cavalryman, the horseman. So in this context, right, for example, for the Romans, normally, the equites also had been knights, you see. So there, as we'll see, this things go literally back then. It's all part of the Indo-European background, not only, right, of all the cultures that spread from the Eurasian steppes in any single people, not just the Indo-European branch, in every single aspect of it, also the Turkic-Mongolian ones, in the same way. So that's why you can't really condensate that into like a moment in which that was born. But starting from the 12th century, right, the dignity of chivalry and the function of fighting on horseback also moved away from each other. Right, while the number of combatants on horseback increased, the feudal monarchies carefully tried to limit and, where possible, reserve the right to arm, right, to dub a knight, that is, to allow access, as we were saying before, to the dignity of chivalry, now considered a privilege and the threshold of entry into a formalized social distinction. Also, there is the important religious aspect, right, in Christianity, and naturally, previously, what was the pagan background of all this, then importantly, as a divide were respectively, literate and illiterate cultures. So, for example, in the 12th century, based on the experience of the wars against the Muslims in Spain and the Near East, there were those who developed the concept, the ideas, the ideal and the institutional forms of a chivalry that basically and totally should have been resolved in the ecclesiastical institution and structures, right? And the same reason why, for example, the military orders were born, that is actually connected to it. Because it reflects also like the role of the knight in the Christian society and what that should have been about in this, latent conflict also between lay and ecclesiastical institutions to control the same chivalry, also from an as we see, also from an ideological point of view. And we have explained how much this ideological aspect was crucial. You can't have a crusader that is not fanatically devoted. You have properly, as a society, to spend to invest an incredible amount of resources to educate these knights to Christianity, which was also a very hard, long thing to do. That is, you have properly to have a church and means of supporting it and spreading teaching and so on. So it's we recently made a video on so-called feudal warfare in outline between the 10th and the 12th century, and we've seen how fundamentally world society revolved around these knights. That is, they were properly the pinnacle of how political practice was mostly resolved in these centuries, especially between the 10th and the 12th, that are crucial, in fact, for the definition of chivalry. There is also, as we were hinting at before, another aspect, that is the relationship between chivalry and freedom. Right. For example, in France, it would have become normal at the end of the 12th century, right, and in the 13th, right, and this doesn't apply everywhere in the same way at all, because there were also knights of ministerial status that is personally not free. Like in Germany, most famously of all other European countries. And this was the case because of the original character of these men. These were basically the retinues, the bands of thugs, of local lords / mobsters that fundamentally were tied personally to the boss. And they were not free technically. Very, very often they were servants themselves, and they eventually were to make a career as noblemen, differently from most of freemen out there, because exactly of this connection, right, which is essentially a mafia one. And this idea of servitude specifically, right, remained in European chivalry as a strong semantic mortgage indicating subordination and service that is proper of the word miles specifically. That in the past wasn't like that, because in Roman times, for example, the miles was something very different. It was the full Roman citizen who received salary for serving militarily. And for this reason, for a long time, and still in France, for example, as we were saying now, well, there was this idea of servitude of the miles was still deep into the 11th century, right? In Lorraine, we made a video about that, for example, in Germany, still in the 12th and 13th centuries, right? The milites were only gradually distinguished from the great nobles that were, called normally as principes, magnates, proceres, optimates. So properly somebody that was powerful for real, and these guys were just their servants, their armed wingmen. And this condition of hierarchical inferiority, together with the gregarial function performed by the milites vis-a-vis the seniores, and the practical interchangeability of the terms, for example, miles and vassus, right, must have closely linked the figure of miles to a relationship of subordination expressed by the military term aliqui, right, which has been the source of many misunderstandings, or giving rise to the idea that knights must necessarily be inserted in a chain of dependencies. That is to say, they have to be someone's knight, properly as a possession, as an object, right? So this makes you understand how behind that idealized, renewed idea of chivalry in the second half of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century is probably also the denial of part of probably also the ethical and ideological reality that stood behind chivalry in that since before, and that would continue also on, because there was fundamentally no way to fix certain dynamics, even on the long run. And this is an important problem, properly concerning also the understanding how medieval societies worked, right? But even the early modern ones in general, right? It was all a clientary society, so there wasn't much that you could escape. Hell, even today, people are basically still living in a sort of feudalism. Literally, think about how many people work, like, depending on, their wage depending on, big bosses, with lots of money, corporations, things like that, that they're virtually their own clients, right? They need that. Things have not really changed that much in that regard. But I guess that this question, I don't know whether I answered properly, because I must be honest with it, that ideal, positive, shiny aspect of, of the night in its positives, it's the one that frankly interests me the least. Because properly, as I studied these things, it's like, it's fascinating, telling the truth. I studied actually certain aspects of this too. Properly, I remember some of the most beautiful things I've read, for example, is the Steirische Rheinchronik, that was written by a guy that from Styria, that was actually from a family of ministeriales in the early 14th century, and that was too sickly to become a knight, and this person developed, probably also because of this complex of inferiority, an enormous artistical sensitivity. We are lucky because we got this. That is an enormous thing. It's like 100,000 verses, all in Middle High German, and they tell us things that are evidently, ideal. In that kind of, in the wake of chivalric tradition, of whatever, the styles, the sophistication. But at the same time, you can read within that still what were the also least ideal motivations and feelings. When you read that, this person makes you understand the feelings that stand behind the knights. I don't know, the day before battle, or what they were thinking before. Even in not so, they said they were scared, they feared. And it's very realistic, telling the truth. And there are some logics that go beyond, right? That there is properly the idea of loyalty, disloyalty. These were, after all themes that in fact were present in chivalric culture, but that when treated properly as a modern chronicle for the time, it's different from believing in the fairy tales of the Carolingian or the Brittonic cycle that people believe to be somewhat historical up to, I don't know, the 18th, the 19th century. And you can always read behind those stories a lot from past cultures, right? And this is fundamentally what I make this series about, because when we look at the night, right, by the dawn of the second millennium of Christ, well, this night looks a little rough and a little uncertain as well. We see it also from. I'm avoiding to talk about the strictly military side of the story, but he could still fight and fought. You see, until the 12th century, there is an interesting overlapping. There isn't properly the full development of chivalry in the properly also in the military superiority in the field of knights. Right, I've read some books sometimes say something different, and I disagree with that, because I believe the full moment of domination of Western battlefields was the 13th century by cavalry. It doesn't matter that we're new competitors, but properly there is not an infantry victory up to that point. Up to the 12th century, regions even like Germany, you don't even have to look at the Celtic Fringe or other areas that were substantially different, but infantry still played an important role, right? Yes, cavalry wasn't, properly, was more important, but it's the most important arm, right? But you understand that infantry still played a great important part, and sometimes even properly from dismounted knights that fought like that. There are lots of pictures in here, and also before the 13th century, our documentation about how these guys actually fought in battle, it's much scannier, right? But from some hints we see that infantry was still important. So the actual dominion of cavalry on Western battlefields is not very long, right? It's something like 150 years, right? And it is not to be taken as for granted either, right? It was a big deal to have a company, and that's why that moment also produced the idea of chivalry, because these people were fundamentally exalted about their own world. They had a completely different view of reality. They were consolidating a position that doesn't matter how much eventually cavalry decreased in importance since the beginning of the 14th century in a relative sense. That would be more evident from the second half of the 15th. But it was normal for this predominion. Eventually, it was consolidated at the time. It was a heavy thing, right? It's an historical process that still, went on up to the end of the 18th or the early 20th century, right? These people dominated society. And we have to get properly used to reason also at these different levels. That is to say, it's not because aristocracy, had more difficulties from a certain point onwards, like in the modern age, to fight on horseback, that the two things are directly proportionally connected. Those people still had a much greater grip at times where cavalry was less important on society than before. Okay, this is another topic, but just to make you understand how what we think as chivalry fundamentally lived on, think about the series we make on Prince Eugene. You understand that those people, those noblemen, were properly raised with, there wasn't much different from a medieval knight in properly what they were expected to do on the field. Right, when it takes properly the guts, the determination, the intelligence to know how to charge an enemy, you can't really make much relativism about that. And instead, there is this huge problem in Western culture, that is to have interpreted properly, the history of the same Western civilization in a sort of progressivistic, democratizing, modernistic way, right? The people, in a sense, need to believe things like that, the Renaissance made things more democratic. It's a lie, because it's exactly the opposite that happened, and that properly crystallized in that very moment for centuries eventually to come again. And no, it's the idea, it has to be how we pictured history from the 19th century, from the 20th century. And in this, the first thing what we do is rejecting the fact that these were not democratic societies at all, that an aristocratic military elite always ruled and was in charge, and was factually, morally, and materially superior to the other people. And that there was a functional reason for that, because in that pre-industrial societies, it worked like that, and there is no way out. And this is present also in many other, basically in any other culture, right? Here, now I will try to address some other point relatively to, in a sense, kind of a Western way of chivalry that did exist, right? But also, it's never to be forgotten what the rest of the world was doing at the time, because it wasn't much different at all. And there are certain mechanistic interpretations that we'll see now that even need, for example, to believe that they don't understand how, from the times of the Greeks and the Romans, in which allegedly, the free citizenry fought just on foot, and it was just about that, where, at a certain point, these barbarians came again to rule in a world of aristocrats, right? There was a guy, some month ago, I made a video on Caesar's dictatorship, and he literally asked me, like, why do you say that, Caesar was a dictator, like, Rome was a republic, and I don't know what else he said. It was a democracy, he said, and I don't know what else, but so you see that there is not the capacity anymore to understand that, Rome was notoriously just an oligarchic reality, and that was turning into a monarchy at that point, and that dictator is the dictator, that is properly a magistracy in the Roman political institutional system, and that, what the hell, right? We should understand it. Even Roman society is very eloquent in that, because in theory, yes, every freeman had to serve in virtue of his own possessions in the army. But so that was the logic. But this logic was subverted when it came to knights. Knights, because of their religious military sacrality in the Indo-European, Latin cultural background, were of course to be paid by the state by a certain amount, because properly they received that sacredness that derives straight from the military deity, overruling deity of the sky, that is the same one the Romans brought the symbol in front of them, thinking that they would have to conquer everything against whom they marched, and that they conquered literally the world. So the idea is the Western world properly comes from societies that didn't have any other, that not just the Western world, by the way, every culture in the world came from a mentality that saw no other moral, political, juridical justification but properly a military religious power to conquer the world as the genetic foundation of all civilization in the history of mankind. Well, this is something that you can't say in a democratic modern reality, because in part properly we have erased this. That is, I dare you, I challenge you to say, if anybody has ever told you these things in school, these are things that if you read, history of religions or history, our anthropology, like all the specialists worldwide, know by default, because it's basically the only thing that existed at the time. But you can't say this because it sounds too much kind of apparently just right wing, but it was actually something that brought to the rise also of democracy itself. And this is properly not understood today, and this connection is completely lost. Like, we are being told stories that were invented on the base essentially of a 19th century nationalist, statalist delusion that looked at history just looking at a country's soil and pretending that has anything to do with any kind of cultural significance. And starting from that base, it's all rigged. It's all a lie. It's all basically a complete misconceptional delusion that we're continuously being fed, and that nobody, properly debunks. And it's so easy to debunk, right? It takes to study these things. Everybody knows that. All these books that we have everywhere, this is not a niche. This is literally the books you study if you want to study medieval chivalry. They say the thing quite openly. Right? Maybe not to the extreme consequences, as I do, because I'm a strange combination of medievalist, non-medievalist, military stern, but also interested in history of religion and things like that. That I came to realize just by also studying these things by myself, and that when I also checked properly specialistic, historiography, I found out that they were actually true. That I wasn't inventing them, that those things are being written since actually lots of generations, and they're still there as properly the most accurate historiographical acquisition that we have in the beginning of the 21st century. So you see, there are deep reasons why we need to believe that, and it's a bit the same why you need to believe that chivalry was born at a certain point, somewhere in the second half of the 12th or early 13th century. It had always been there. The Romans had them, the Germans had them, the Celts had them, hell, even the Greeks had them, in spite of all the democratic thing. But you look at their religion. It's all about horses, deities of war. The same, for not talking about the Iranian peoples. This was true for the Slavs themselves. The glory, the eagle, were already there. These were universal. This was a universal language. We shared it all. And it doesn't even stop the Indo-Europeans. And it's almost embarrassing I don't know, you tell me, did you literally, because I can also maybe fixate in my own mental box, but, honestly, did you ever know about this before? Honestly, did anybody tell you? No, because I was, raised, as a kid in the 90s, they didn't, nobody told me. I'd never known. I've never known, and I came here to know, and the question is, to know it better, also to explain it, to expand it further, and that's what I'm doing fundamentally. But it's possibly the greatest elephant in the room that nobody has ever been told about history, and that it's literally at the base of everything we know as properly as a culture, because surprise, surprise, this culture came mostly from just the military, the warlike ones of the steppes. These existed in part, of course, in also sedentary societies, but this fundamentally would dilute them over time. It's the same reason why we don't remember about it today, right? Like, even just a guy 200 years ago would have understood much better what we're talking about, because in the legends, in the stories of the faith, they would have heard, they would have believed certain things. It would have been normal, instinctive almost. But the truth being is that, the Eurasian steppes poured for millennia continuously at different waves, what we know fundamentally as our own cultures, not because there wasn't anything before. The most developed civilizations were to absorb these guys and to fundamentally, integrate this thing, but the culture of these warlike peoples became the dominant ones. This is easy to be seen even in Europe, right? It's not that the Germans brought, a level of, civilization back into the post-Roman Europe. They were absorbed by the Romans and began to write in Latin, whatever, but the ideals of military life, etc., it's fundamentally something we believe still today. It's the idea of being chivalrous, courtly with women. It's this characteristic: you have to be a man, you have to be courageous. There is some biological root to that as well. No doubt, it's not a culturalist thing. It's real, right? But it's much also more deeply ingrained than we think properly from an ideological point of view. And for reasons that are not so banal as they seem, because at the time they served properly to regulate certain societies. But this is now, I'm digressing, but let's say, speaking of that night at the dawn of the second millennium, right? The question, we can recognize them. Like if you had seen one, literally, you had a camera going back to 11th century, seeing one of these guys passing by, you would recognize at night, right? At this stage of history of Europe. But the question is, where did he come from? Like beyond the historic process, who did configure him as an elite warrior? Like properly from a mental point of view, where did his prestige come from? Where did his self-awareness come from beyond the quality of his functions, right? And we have to pose ourselves this question, not because we don't know the answer, we do today, but because most people have seen the knight just the armor, the weapons, the fight, even think that he fought on horseback. That seems to be the most identificative thing, but it's not even just that, right? Because this chivalric mindset existed even among peoples that traditionally fought on foot, largely, or for centuries and centuries. So one always approaches with some perplexity to treat the problem of origins. Because you may say that these origins, there are more roots than origins, right? The origins are lost in times we can't even study fundamentally. So, because you see, merely proposing the question in such terms may seem a belated obedience to a sort of evolutionary tradition which has now been set aside, as we know, because even here the roots are properly plural, right? There are multiple ones. It's never like just one source, one spring, and then it came. It's seducing to simplify it like that, but it's never quite the case. But the older discussions, for example, from the deluded 19th and 20th century positivistic, progressistic, modernistic scholars was, for example, looking, and even properly from medievalists, right, to say whether the origins of chivalry would have to be found, for example, just, in the Germanic antiquities, or in the Roman militia, or in the Arab-Persian East. The first video I made on demand back in the day was 3 years ago, almost, was from a guy. I don't know if he's still around, but it was an interesting one because he also had, he was a history teacher, but also in properly in a religious school. I think it was from Pennsylvania, I don't remember. But one of the things he asked me was probably like, what are the roots of Western chivalry? And the first thing he hypothesized himself, he said, you know, it must be, from the Parthian Sassanid cataphracts, right? Right. So you see, in this guy's mind, well, he was clever, right? But the point was that, fundamentally, knighthood to be reduced to a technical thing. That is to say, heavy cavalry. That is, which other peoples fundamentally used this? Well, it was mostly right around in Persia, right? There was this bias. I also had this bias too. I believed, for example, that Persian cataphracts were fundamentally the heaviest thing that you could find around. Historically, it was not true. Right? Those were already a bit lighter than, for example, the ones of the steppes. Then, truly, there were different societies, but there were different reasons why they developed in this way. And then here we can't digress why, because on the reason. I mean, because armies were organized in different ways. There were different needs of tactical specialization. This is not important. But the idea was, medieval chivalry, isn't it that happening, because, eventually you guys went to crusades, they found cataphracts or stuff like that. It's all Eastern influence. No, this is a mechanistic belief that fundamentally today is completely skipped, right? And we tend to see much more instead, probably the most, also much more evident connection with Europe. The steppe in Europe finishes basically in Austria, territorially speaking. So we have it next door, and this thing kept pouring these peoples from like hell, like properly the finest equestrian cultures out there. It's like, where did the Byzantines take stirrup from? I've said from the Persians. No, probably actually took it from the Avars, from the Pannonian Basin, and also the problem was the stirrup, was also a heavy one, because why the stirrup did not the stirrup fundamentally had no importance in the development of cavalry whatsoever. It was just a consequence of it. And that's also tough to make people understand that technology hasn't shit to do with anything military historical in a decisive sense, right? It's the least that you can think of. But that's also another thing that we took to read and comment the Wolf from Krieger to explain. But already this thought is something, why? Why? Because the modern mind is wired to think it must be a mechanic problem. It's something that I can measure, with a scientific hard fact experiment, right, that I get, and here I have it. This has nothing to do with history. You can't do history if you think that you can measure things in absolute. You can't. Already by the fact that history is dominated by moral forces, there is no calculator that can measure them. So you have to completely change your mindset, which is something that most people are not willing to do. That's why so many people are deluded, even with certain scientific visions of reality that properly are anti-scientific by philosophy of science, that is not properly digested. Because people can't accept to live in a world that they will never understand by definition. That we can't just, see how something of it works and trying to make, to get a positive application from it here and there. We should be content with that. It's already a big deal. No, there must be a fixed, fact-checkable truth that everybody... This is a doctrinary, dogmatic, essentially almost... it's a violent, it's a passive-aggressive behavior. It tells the history of insecurity, of ignorance, of inadequacy, and in the past, where communities were much more pressured by circumstances and they didn't have to think about bullshit. This mindset didn't exist. That's why those people were fundamentally more intelligent to cope with reality than we are today. Today we are more developed. There is no doubt about that. We have a different form of intelligence, but it's one that has a much greater degree of detachment from reality than before. That's also why reading sources is crucial to be done properly and well. Right, and so all those origins, it's just, what is chivalry? It's just Germanic, it's just Roman, it's just Arab, Persian, whatever. All this stuff is being happily skipped, and also entirely skipped from the one who today is the greatest scholar of chivalry as a social phenomenon. That is Georges Duby, right? and the guy abandoned the field of hypothesis and relied, in order to date chivalry to a precise and concrete historical fact. And that's why today I talk about that, since I received that answer, that even though the topic was picked randomly, on the fundamentally the presence in the documentary sources of the term miles, used in the sense of fighter on horseback, starting, that's why I also use mostly this date, with certainty, at least from the 3rd and slash last quarter of the 10th century, right? Relatively to the question of being posed, there is also a huge thing to stress that you can see at every level of medieval history, especially this has been pointed out very, very loudly by especially the socio-economical one, also the history of technologies, that you see, this whole thing of chivalry goes in parallel with what was usually thought to be the so-called rebirth of the year 1000, right? The idea that magically, from one day to another, Europe began to boom economically, and that this happened just because, there are sources that say that. Now, sources are not the truth. And as we understand today, with a certain degree of safety, is that that boom actually had already happened. That is to say, in the moment in which we start seeing sources talking about that, the thing had already happened, right? That is already the consequence of it. So even Dubé's datation has to take that into consideration. It's interesting because the 10th century is properly also where we place today, with a century in advance, the so-called rebirth of the year 1000, or at least its beginning. That also in here, it can be easily traced also in previous centuries, the 9th, especially in the 8th, etc. But to say that there was a stream here, that you can't really say, okay, well, it begins just from here because, what brings from the source was pushing for the same downstream for what you can see downstream. So it doesn't mean anything to cut, right? So, on the other hand, it can be said that Dubé once again reproposed the question of the origins, as well indeed to propose that of, in fact, of prehistory of medieval chivalry, right? At least to indicate the importance in that sense and in that direction of a study that can't be just historical, sic et simpliciter, but also archaeological on the one hand and anthropological on the other, right? You can't properly study history of chivalry thinking that, in fact, it began just from day to another. I appreciate that there is the understanding, of course, it's not just about heavy cavalry. When heavy cavalry is born, even the question, heavy cavalry is born ever since humans domesticated horse for riding on their back on war, right? Which they did actually after having tied them to chariots, right? And because it was easier before. So heavy cavalry exists in a strategical sense in the moment in which there is cavalry that can clash with other cavalry. That is heavy cavalry. There is properly not a heavy cavalry as we imagine it. Also in the Middle Age, like what's after all the difference between, I don't know, an 8th, 10th, 11th century knight? There aren't substantial differences. It's from a technical point of view, it's rather from a level of collective training that also changed something slightly in the technical equipment, mostly as overwhelmingly as a consequence of the same, that makes the difference, right? And we will have to make lots of videos about cavalry also in this sense to properly understand how technological aspects are so dramatically overrated, and that even the way knights used the lance as it must have been first overarm, then underarm, or eventually like the couché grip, right? It changed in that year. No, it didn't. Does it even matter? like from a military point of view, be concretely knowing, even just, read the sources, even if they don't tell, many other aspects, but surely they're not going to tell you that, right? Because they don't care, it doesn't matter, right? And even when it happened, normally it's because we made war, it was normal at the time. It was also so universal in the way you could fight. How do you think that fighters changed altogether in this war? Chivalry is mostly a political and social product that then is reflected from a military point of view. Duby says, and we have recalled this other time, that the success of the word miles, right, in the sense of warrior to court, by the same time of warrior on horseback, almost only those who use the horse could not now be defined as warrior, right, in the 10th century, is to be evaluated as the result of three complementary facts that really gets down to what chivalry is about, right? So there is a technical one, indeed, the superiority of the rider in combat. Then a social one, the link between the kind of life considered noble and the use of the horse, that as you see already existed, right? By the 10th century, it's not later on. An institutional one, right? That is to say, the limitation of military service to a small circle, to an elite, proper, because they costed a lot and they needed a very specific training and equipment and so on. So of the three facts in which Duby sees the essence of the success of medieval cavalry at its beginning, is we know is the institutional one, right? Historians and archaeologists daily torment the technical aspect, right? The discussion, as we were saying, on the stirrup, right, has become so disgustingly classic as a theme that even at the level of non-specialists, it's literally one of the single most overrated and useless topics one could bring to the fore, right? Okay, it's important by a certain degree, but just literally mostly from an archaeologist, not much because of a military historian, right? It doesn't matter that much, right? It's much more interesting to study collective training, not the stirrup in itself. That's just, as we were saying, a consequence of. People didn't use the stirrup because somebody popped out magically from the step, telling them, "Look, I get this thing that you can fix yourself better with on horseback." Wow, the genius arrived. It didn't happen like that, right? That thing was needed, and known just right. So from much time before, right, our later stirrups, for many previous times, it became like official. Even, we have little girls' tombs, I don't know, in Longobert, Italy, that had, some stirrup, right, before it became, centuries before it became standard for cavalry, right? What do you think it takes to properly conceptualize the idea of the stirrup? The question is, how did they fight and how much did they need that, right? And how much, properly clashing, charging straight into enemy, compact enemy formations with that level of collective training had never been achieved in the West for cavalry, and with all, properly that all together political, social, zootechnic, etc., know-how, etc., that would need these guys not to be to remain more stably on horseback, to avoid literally being catapulted out, over the horse, from the horse at the moment of impact, right? It's not a problem that ancient cavalry didn't have, but ancient cavalry was different, right? It didn't have the same shock force, right? It also, the horses were properly different. The grip on the ground was different. The role in those societies of cavalry was different. And there is no way that there is also, like in the history of the steppes, there was all a technical improvement. They didn't remain all the same. It was properly a change. And we see that these things are connected in that way, but that change comes mostly from a political and social background. And then all the rest follows. Then there is, for example, the least known fact in this regard about chivalry is probably the social or socio-cultural one, if you prefer, relating, and this is what I think it's interesting to stress, to to the very deep and ancient link between the use of the horse, and not only this we would like to stress even more, kind of life esteemed as noble, but rather a whole complex magical religious set of rites and beliefs connected to the function of the horse as an intermediary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Right? If one doesn't properly interiorize this concept of the horse as a uranic and tonic animal that fundamentally embodied the same forces that these warriors literally were possessed by properly right belief and magic, in order to face combat, that is something that you need. I don't even know to find the right adjective in terms of psychophysical capabilities combined to be able to go into, right, that dominated properly the entire worldview of these people. Right, the universe was read through these symbols. The horse is the blood and the mud and the flesh coming from the underground, and from the dead, from the composition, from the humus, from the regeneration. Then it flies to the skies, to the pure heavens, to the world of the souls, where the dead warriors rise to properly to be at the side of the gods, right? To be worth them through a worthy life and death spent in war. This is what fundamentally still exists in the mind of a medieval knight. And for strictly historical reasons, this is not always documentable. This is not always properly understood, and it continues to be brutally overlooked in history. It's important to note that those rites and beliefs reached also classical antiquity and the Western Middle Ages, where they were obviously transformed and adapted to different mental parameters, at least from certain sources, than others, didn't speak properly, and especially the military in that regard. That came altogether, however, from the same area of origin of the primitive spread of horse itself, that is, Central Asia, mainly through the various Iranian peoples, that is, the Persians, the Scythians, the Sarmatians. Also during the migration era, the Eastern German peoples who stayed in closer contact with these and with the Turkic Mongolian lineages that were pushing towards the west. Right? There are beautiful studies, for example, by Scartilli about this, how much, for example, the medieval West owes in this process of cultural synthesis to the Goths. So anyhow, but this was present at a deeper level, also in other more Western realities, right? It was way more shared within properly also before the migration era, as we were saying before, by peoples that tendentially we don't consider exactly in these terms, right? Because we don't want to conceive the oligarchic or also properly a question-obsessed aspect of their cultures, right? This is kind of obvious to me. For the Greeks, the Romans, the Celts, the Germans, it's under, it's very easy. Look at their art, look at their religion, look at their society, right? It was all about that fundamentally, and not only that, right? Migration era, and we have talked abundantly about it on Schwerpunkt. There is a pretty hefty playlist by now. Well, if you look at these various peoples, they were by that time, if you look at North Africa, Arabia, whatever, they were all changing. They were heavily relying on horses and all developing their own kind of properly of chivalry in a sense. For example, the Muslims had something similar. They call it the youth. It was a set of rules of etiquette. They surely influenced also, say, medieval chivalry in Europe during the Middle Ages. But it was more universal than that. The same goes for the Byzantines, right? Actually, the Crusades brought to this idea that fundamentally it's all about, the Westerners and the Muslims, right? But the hypocrisy also the fact that Constantinople was sacked in 1204 somewhat obscures the fact it was a chivalry also in Constantinople that we can't maybe get that much because that society was at a point also, more unitary and less, diverging, like from its sources production does not help a huge deal, but also in there we can easily see that, right, by many, from many aspects of Byzantine culture, art, etc., that were even there. Cavalry and chivalry and even knighthood by a certain degree was a big deal, right? So, in short, the superiority of the knight in our Middle Ages has various, even if coinciding and complementary aspects, right? And there is this beautiful passage from, from Percival from the Arthurian legend, after which I titled the video, that tells you more than many others what properly it meant in this broader spiritual background that is still only superficially Christian, actually. So today we didn't talk about that aspect, but all this is like imagine at the dawn of the first millennium AD that Europe comes from thousands of years of paganism. So even if the people are Christianized by now, that's a formal aspect that coexists at every, basically at every level, popular with that set of beliefs that doesn't matter we're talking about theistic or pagan, whatever, it's still there. It's part of folklore, of cultural, history of Europe. It still, was present before mostly, up to 1 century ago, right? It mostly the population of the countryside, people coming living in the city that probably eradicated all that kind of tradition from stories from our knowledge, like our parents, our grandparents in part definitely know much more than us still about that, especially in certain areas of Europe. And there is it's closer to the world we were conceiving, and it's easy to understand. It's not a fully Christian reality. Christianity came to mediate values that are universal, right? And that's why it's significant and its success, telling the truth. But, it's easy to understand that these stories have very often basically nothing about in terms of Christian morals from a concrete point of view, or at least, they're ambiguous, sometimes properly not explaining. You see, we have seen it also in the series on medieval animal symbolism. It's, sometimes certain things do not make sense in the readaptation because still, already at that time, something was lost, right, about that previous knowledge. And yeah, still there wasn't, considered at the time, it wasn't properly an historical awareness. That is, these beliefs were what made up for it, in a sense. So they were not fully rationalized. Probably, I don't know, these knights knew stories that would have been mind-blowing to hear, that they probably liked and believed, and, it's easy to understand. Look at what, I don't know, even at the Carolingian court, what they sang about, what were the stories about, and there is a very few Christianity about that, really, leaving aside that Carolingians were much more about Jewish, properly, Old Testament stuff rather than New Testament, because it was much more directly military in nature and bloody and whatever. So yeah, that they loved that, right? That's the Frankish, connaturate hematophilia. But it derives from that background, right? Well, this passage tells about the young and naive Percival who, hearing the din of weapons caused by some marching knights in the deep forest, thinks first of the demons. This is important to stress. But then, so beautiful and powerful, so similar to the Michaels, Georges, and Martins venerated on the altars of the churches of his time, he believes he is before the angels of the Lord and prostrates himself on the ground and worships them, responds with all his strength to a dark but powerful archetypal appeal, right? And the same is answered by the mother, right? Taught by experience, but at the same time participating in the same sacred horror. When hanging her son, she pities him dismayed. Quote, "I think you have seen the angels of which people say that they kill everything they touch." Right, so this page is, it's as moving as vibrating, right, in deep, profound religiosity, right, even if very little and only superficially Christian, as we have seen, but perhaps it's the most intimate cave to the superiority of the medieval knight over the man of his time, right? And it's frightening, because you see that also in the Bible, you would say angels. What are angels? Notoriously, the Old Testament is a half polytheistic thing, right? If you just read it banally, it talks about different gods, different specific sacrifice, and so on. Angels are nothing but fundamentally the relics, or sometimes not even so much so, of the pagan gods, Mesopotamian, pre-existing Jewish monotheism that was being structured, and the Bible in that sense is beautiful to start. And these gods were powerful. Angels are fundamentally, Uranic and Chthonic figures, just like the horse, just to make an example, just like, you see this idea of the superior god that tames these giants, right? These monsters. The angels are violent, right? They kill, they copulate with women in the Bible. They have a properly, they have that ethos that belongs fundamentally, as we were saying before, to an exclusively religious and military reality that was the only one known. These are the same angels of the Bible, are basically like Achilles in the Iliad. They're the same thing. These cultures were shared by all the Near East. The Iliad is notoriously like a blend of that and the Indo-European traditions, and they're basically sharing the same identical things. A Mycenaean warlord that landed on a Greek beach, and local fishermen would have thought of them to be demigods, right? They literally existed. It's like in in Gaelic Ireland, where most of the so-called deities, still in a mystic sense, were their shrines were just tombs of ancient chieftains, right? That were then gradually deified in a gradual process. Angels are this. Knights are this, because knights reach in this period, in the 10th century, etc., that kind of level of elite and moral and material superiority that is sacred by God and for God to wage war and destruction in case of need, right? It's the wrath of God. It's what does the Saint Michael Archangel does, sword in hand, right? This is not a pacifist. There is nothing more stupid, but I believe, take me from this, to believe that, Christianity or any other religion is a pacifistic thing. Pacifism is horrifying, is as disgusting as militarism, right? These are pacific societies. It's the idea that there has to be a justice, a pacifier. And history of mankind tells us pretty clearly that if you don't have sword in hand, even just, or in its sheath, and in a deterrent sense, you cannot rule, you cannot have a justice, you cannot have a civilization. We derive from this, right? And it's deeply imbued and understood. And why do we like war? It's horrifying, but we like it because we understand the power laying in it, that there is the moral superiority of accomplishing the understanding of whether to do right and whether to do wrong, and making the choice of it, and to make a better world that you can't do violently or non-violently, right? And that you hopefully don't need it to be violence, but that there must always be as a political option, because otherwise you couldn't even fight tyranny. There wouldn't be resistance, like means that, the culture of more than half of the Western world that is founded on resistance since 80 years would be null without violence, right? Tell these things to your children, because they're not telling them anymore anything of that kind, right? They're making them believe that there is just a static, strange world where you just have to conform to, stating that you are good and nice, and then, being a total idiot that can literally kill another person or rape, a woman or whatever, because they don't have properly a civilizational intelligence, right? And these knights here, they did the worst things ever, right? You don't want to read medieval chronicles of what they said, what these knights did. These people, as Parsifal's mother says, literally killed everything they touched, right? And they were as good as evil, right? And that's why Parsifal thinks that they were demons at the beginning and then thinks they were angels, because there is no difference. Lucifer is the greatest angel of all, and it becomes the Antichrist himself. And this is about the dual nature of mankind, that it has always an opportunity to make the difference, right? And original sin cannot be eliminated. We can't hope to be redeemed by ourselves, right? And we need this higher value, and to live in it in order to accomplish good. We must also do evil to do some more good at some point, right? This was deeply understood at the time, because at the time, very often there was not even a choice. These people wouldn't, right? And the way they were trained to become knights was brutal. I always tell that story. Today I will not say it, because it's too heartbreaking, it's too destroying, it's too traumatizing. Being dubbed knight was a curse, together with a blessing. So it is life, right? And this is what the wisdom of these civilizations tell us, and that we're completely forgetting about. And these values had always existed. They get lost in the millennia, and the knight had always embodied them. Why the knight? Why the guy on horseback? Because he was richer than the others, because he owned more wealth, he owned more people. He was responsible for them all. These were societies that were invested basically everything, right? The myth of, the oppressors that in the dark Middle Ages that, were just treasuring and making all the peasants starving to death. This is a description that is more fitting for the modern age, or even the contemporary one, than the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, they didn't have much of a choice but functionalizing this system, right? And it was a curse as much as the berserker condition was, right? This came straight from the same background. It's all tribal, right? Indo-Europeans were tribes, and even when they settled in Europe, they maintained these beliefs as tribesmen, as chieftains. It was a worse world than ours, right? They never think that this was something we have to imitate. This is something we have to understand, because if we don't understand what it was, we will never understand what we are now and how much it is worth, and how much we should be thankful for these things, as evil as they sound, to have happened, for us to have grown and to have controlled the situation better through that same violence, through that same deterrence, when intelligently used, which is also what we're losing in capacity in these times, in a way, because the world is ever more complex and complicated, and we are detaching ourselves, as we have seen, properly in the positive intellective capacity of making sense and fixing the world, right? And until we don't understand this perspective and its scale, we can never do better. That's why these things are important to know. And we shall never forget them, because it's what we are, right? If, God forbid, one day we'll come back, a nuclear holocaust to that time, we would behave in the same exact way, because it was pretty much universal in nature to behave like that. level of crop rate, with production, with that level of of resources, of energetic potential, technological capabilities, fundamentally that, right? So reflect on this, right? And we will, of course, keep talking about that, and I hope that this video serves to something, to explain a part of what I'm talking about. Today, I haven't talked about properly how the deep connection, right, between this time, the eve of the second millennium AD, and in what was before, right? But that's the legacy that we have to understand in this process, and the force that moved the latter. It wasn't born in the Middle Ages. Chivalry is not born in the Middle Ages, right? And it's more human altogether, also instinctively, not necessarily reasonably, and as modernity proved, that's also something we have to remember. But again, if we don't understand this in perspective, we will never understand even what our modernity means, and why we should be very, very careful about everything we do. Anyhow, for today, I stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.